Hello again. In the description to this video, you will find a link to a YouTube video financed and organised by the BBC in 2019. In it, young black people talk about how angry they are to hear about the supposed lynching of a black man in Britain in 1919. They'd never heard about this, it seems. The reason they'd never heard about it is because it didn't happen. They've been told a series of lies by black writers and can hardly be blamed for not knowing that these people have been lying to them. The BBC and The Guardian have enthusiastically helped to spread this false history, and the consequence is that a lot of black people are now convinced that black people were being lynched in England during the 20th century. The motive behind this fabrication can only be to stir up tension and make young black people believe that just as there were lynchings in the United States a century ago, so too were there in Britain. Here is David Olusoga's account from a children's book, which was awarded a prize a few days ago. Astonishingly enough. I read it out a day or two back. I won't read the whole thing. It says here they're talking about the riots in Liverpool. On one night of fighting, someone called the police. They raided a house and a young black man snuck out of a back door to escape. He was a 24-year-old sailor from Bermuda named Charles Wotton. The angry crowd out in the street spotted him running away and chased him for over a mile. At the water's edge, he either fell or was pushed into the water. No one was ever arrested for his murder. Right. In a piece for The Guardian, to which I provide a link above, Olusoga says bluntly, in Liverpool, Charles Wotton, a sailor who had served Britain in the war, was killed by a mob in the Liverpool docks. His murder can only be described as a lynching. Reni Eddo-Lodge, in a book called Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, says the same thing, describing it as a public lynching. She writes that it was one of the most horrific race hate crimes in Britain. 24-year-old black seaman Charles Wotton was accosted by an enraged white crowd and thrown into the King's Dock. Olushoga talked about this on BBC television, and a plaque has even been placed in Liverpool to commemorate this lynching. The thumbnail to this video shows a crowd of black people who were invited to see this, again as a way of inciting hatred. No wonder that the black people in that video commissioned by the BBC are angry. If this was a true story, then they'd be quite right to be angry. It's not true, though. Here is what really happened. I know something about this because of a book of mine which was published in 2016 called 1919, Britain's Year of Revolution. It contained a chapter devoted to this subject. In the description to this video, I give some newspapers which covered the events at the time for those who wish to check for themselves what happened, and I urge people to track down the original sources, don't take my word for it. Ports were at one time rough places where fighting and disorder were common. There was stiff competition for work, and often foreign sailors were the object of anger because they often worked for less than English crews. In London, Cardiff and Liverpool, scraps between English and Chinese, African and Arabs, Danes, Swedes, Russians and all kinds of other combinations were common right up to the days of containerisation in the 1970s. In the summer of 1919, there was a lot of disorder across the whole country. In the area around the Liverpool docks in the summer of 1919, there was tension between Swedish, Danish, Russian and black sailors, each accusing the others of trying to cheat them out of work. On the evening of June the 4th, a young black man called John Johnson was in a pub in Bailey Street when he was asked for a cigarette by a Dane. He refused and was then assaulted. This was just a punch-up sort of thing that happened in dockside pubs. To understand what happened next, we need to remember that most fights at that time were just a matter of fists and boots. The black sailors, though, often carried knives, razors and even guns. The following night, 8 friends of Johnson's ambushed some of the Scandinavians who were coming out of the pub in Bailey Street and attacked them with knives and cutthroat razors, inflicting some very serious injuries, by the way. According to the Yorkshire Evening Post, a policeman came upon the fight, and when he tried to restore order, he was badly slashed about the face and back. This was Constable 157C Parkinson, and he was cut all around his face, and they tried to cut his throat as well, although he survived. Some of those present when he was attacked were later charged with attempted murder. The black men then moved on to the Scandinavian home, a seaman's mission for Swedes and Danes, and attacked the first man they saw outside. This was Thomas Johansson. He was stabbed in the back. There were a lot of use of knives by those black men, by the way. By this time, reinforcements were on their way from the Argyle Street police station, and so the black men decided to head back to their own lodgings in Upper Pitt Street. A crowd of Scandinavians and Russians, with some English and Irish men, followed them. When the black men went into the place where they were staying, the crowd outside became noisy and threatening. According to a report by the Liverpool Watch Committee, who were in charge of the police, the crowd then began to drift away when the police told them to when they arrived, and the police then banged on the door to speak to the men inside. Remember that they were investigating at this point a series of stabbings, including that of a police officer who had had his throat cut. It was at this point that things deteriorated because one of the black men in the house leaned out of the window and began shooting at the police. Constable 245C Brown was shot in the head. The bullet went into his mouth and then out of the back of his neck, where it then wounded Sergeant 25C Getty. PC 51C Fox dived for cover and broke his wrist in the process. The person who was suspected of shooting at the police, who was Charles Wotton, by the way, then tried to escape from the back of the house. The police set up a hue and cry, and the crowd, which had been leaving at that point, ran after him. The police were very angry that no one likes being shot at like that. When they reached the docks, Wotton was either pushed in or jumped in the water to escape the pursuers. 13 black men later appeared in court charged with the attempted murder of 3 police officers. You will observe that none of this is mentioned in the account by David Olushoga, nor does Reni Eddo-Lodge's book say anything about it. By editing out the stabbings and shootings and the attempted murder of the 3 police officers, who, by the way, was almost certainly Charles Wotton that fired the gun, it is possible to disguise the whole thing as a racist murder. I find it disgusting that people would do this, though, apparently with the intention of stirring up racial friction. The fact that the young black people in that BBC video are so angry is entirely down to their being shamefully deceived by writers who really ought to know better. Another piece of deception is that these disorders are represented as targeting black people who were the only victims of violence. In fact, more white people than black were killed during the Troubles in the British docks that summer. In Cardiff, for instance, rioting began on June the 11th and continued for 3 days. Things were so bad that the Chief Constable appealed for army units to be put on standby. Once again, it seemed to be the black sailors who were using firearms and stabbing people. On the evening of June the 11th, a young discharged soldier called Harold Smart approached a police officer and said that a black man had cut his throat. So it proved, for he bled to death on the way to hospital. An Irishman called Thomas Donovan was shot dead by a black man as well during the rioting. The police were also shot at in Cardiff. That night, the body of a black man was found. He'd been stabbed through the heart. On June the 12th, a crowd of white people surrounded a house at 264 Boot Street, where some black people were staying. Fierce fight ensued between the two groups. When the police broke it up, they found that Mohammed Abdullah had died of head injuries. So in that riot, 2 black men and 2 white men were killed. I cannot imagine why anybody would wish to mislead young people about all this by concealing information and using that emotive word lynching, which is redolent of the Deep South and the Ku Klux Klan. When the author of a book called Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race uses the death of Charles Woodham as an example of structural racism, as she describes it, and calls it a public lynching, then I find it hard not to assume that it's an attempt to incite ill feeling among black people. Indeed, anybody watching that YouTube video can see how angry the young black people have been made by this untruthful version of events. I have not the least doubt that both David Olushoga and Reni Eddo-Lodge both know the facts as well as I do, and that they have deliberately chosen not to mention the shootings and stabbings which led up to Charles Woodham's death, the better to portray him as an innocent victim of structural racism. It's quite shocking.